welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, platter up your favorite Buddy Holly or Beach Boy record. Think about Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon frolicking on the beach in Malibu, Mickey Rooney waltzing across the MGM lot in full Andy Hardy garb, and James Dean, well, just being James Dean, and a ton of other teen actor icons down through the decades as we welcome our guest, author Bruce Handy, who will discuss his amazing new book, Hollywood High, subtitled A Totally Epic Way, Opinionated History of Teen Movies. Bruce is a journalist, critic, humorist, and children's book author multiple times, who also spent a season writing for Saturday Night Live. Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, Bruce.
All right, thanks. So glad to be here, Steve. Really appreciate it.
You have definitely taken a segment of pop culture and analyzed it with a deep focus, under a microscope, per se. And I have to start off my interview by asking you about your movie-going experiences as a youth. Where did you grow up, and what was your favorite movie theater?
Well, okay, so I grew up in Palo Alto, California. I actually grew up on I literally grew up on the Stanford campus. Stanford basically built its own suburb in the 1950s. So it was literally a company town. My father was kind of a communications director for Stanford, and pretty much everybody else was professors. But yeah, so in those days there were I guess there were about five. We had about five movie theaters. I think there were, no, there's more. We had about four movie theaters in Palo Alto, and then nearby in Menlo Park, we had three more. So I guess we had about seven, and then Los Altos. So we had about eight, kind of in those days, first run movie theaters you could go to. One of them is still going, the Stanford Theater, which was in downtown Palo Alto, and was refurbished maybe 20 years ago now. It's now a beautiful revival house where they show, old Hollywood films and sometimes science. They actually have a beautiful, beautiful old organ. I don't know if it was original and restored or if it's something that was brought in, but that they play for when they show silent movies and stuff. And yeah, I'm sure anybody who is a fan of your podcast, if they're ever in Palo Alto, and it's a beautiful old kind of, mission style, I think must be late 1920s
Oh,
theater, just a lovely little gem and worth visiting if you're in the area.
well, I know it well because my wife went to Stanford, her brother went to Stanford, her father went to Stanford. We're always up there for reunions, and I walked by that revival house a lot. Definitely. First movie experiences, in your memory, can you remember one of the first movies that made an impact on you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can tell you the very first movie I saw was The Sword and the Stone, the Disney animated, not one of their greatest works. I think it was 62, 61 or 62, I forget exactly. But yeah, I saw that. My grandparents lived in Glendale, California, and I saw that in one of the big, oh, the Alex Theater. It was an old Egyptian theater in
Sure.
downtown Glendale. So yeah, that was my first. Yeah, at some point, maybe in my 30s, in the VHS era, I think I rented Sword in the Stone to kind of see, oh, so this was my first movie. What was this? And yeah, no, does not a great one, not a great first movie. I think
It's
the first movie that really had an impact on me was seeing Mary Poppins at the Varsity Theater in Palo Alto, which was a great theater that later became an important theater for me because it was the first revival house that I knew of. I think it switched to a revival format when I was still in high school, probably in 74 or 75. So that was a big deal for me. But yeah, seeing Mary Poppins in its first release when I was in first grade was, yeah, I'm not sure I've ever been more entertained at a movie than I was by that film at that particular age. Yeah, just like what a What a
Well,
delight. Yeah.
I think I'm a decade ahead of you. That was my first teen year. I turned 13 in fall '64. So while you were seeing Poppins as a elementary school student, I was seeing Goldfinger as a teenager.
Oh, well, that's what it talk about a perfect. Yeah, that must have been
Well,
like a mind meld between viewer and filmmaker. Yeah, a 13-year-old seeing Goldfinger. Wow.
well, particularly since my dad had dropped off the book on my desk earlier in the year, and I was reading Doctor Dolittle and the Hardy Boys and Tom Swift, and then he puts a picture, I mean, a paperback on my desk with a naked woman on the cover, all tastefully covered, of course, but she
Yeah.
was all in gold, and that was the beginning of my interest in James Bond. And as you probably know, or maybe not know, I've written 6 books on the subject, including 4 editions of the Encyclopedia of James Bond movies. So it definitely had an impact on me. I have to tell you that, I read a lot of film books. I see a lot of books that are kind of phoned in. This book of yours, Hollywood High, is so elegantly researched, and your knowledge of not only the teen movies, but the history behind the people who were in the movies is fascinating to read. So, for those of you who are interested in film history and particularly this subject matter, run to get this book. It is a lot of fun. Um, I learned a lot of things. In fact, the whole concept of being a teenager was shaped by some of your early writing here. I naturally assumed that teenagers exist in biblical times,
Yeah.
and
Well, I mean, technically they did. Yeah.
they did, but the concept of enjoying a teen lifestyle is a relatively a late 20th century or middle 20th century
Yeah.
phenomenon. I was
Well,
fascinated what you talked about the fact that children from leaving the cradle and then they entered the workforce very early. They didn't even go to school regularly in the early part of the 20th century. T Tell the audience a little bit what you discovered about the nature of teenagedom.
well, yeah. I mean, this was all kind of new to me too. I mean, obviously, I knew that back in the days before we had child labor laws, you had 6-year-olds working in factories and stuff like that. But yeah, I didn't quite understand. I didn't know the whole sort of really the narrative of the history and how it changed. I mean, just looking at the turn of the last century in 1900, I believe the figure was 7% of 18-year-olds had graduated from high school, and maybe, I don't know, maybe another 10% had attended some high school. Then you jump to 1941, and that's the first year where more than a majority, more than, I think the number was 51 or 52% of 18-year-olds had graduated from high school, and that was really the kind of the difference, from those first 4 decades of the 20th century. I mean, partly it's due to, you have educational reformers and social reformers who are trying to get, kids off the streets and into school. Obviously education is a good thing. Nobody disputes that. So, you start having more and more, they start building more schools. You have more and more places put in, compulsory education rules for children. And then what really kind of turbocharges the whole thing is actually the Great Depression, because you start having, with such huge unemployment, if people in their 20s and 30s who have families to support don't want to be competing with 13-year-olds for jobs. So that's when you really have the kind of final legal and political push to really get kids into school and to have them be in school through 18 years. So the consequence of that is that then suddenly you have the majority of kids are are going to school and they're spending time just with their peer group, which isn't something necessarily they did before. If you're like a 13-year-old working as a bellboy in a hotel, like the hero of an American tragedy, you're hanging out with 20-year-olds and 30, it's a different world than just, an entirely teenage world. So once you do have kids all sort of stuck together, spending time together, you start having teenage culture. They start developing their own slang, their own tastes in music, their own, styles in clothes. They start basically becoming, a tribe in a way. And that's the beginning of also the beginning of adults starting to see teenagers as this kind of, almost an other in a way.
Well, here we
And that's
are.
also then, happily for MGM, that's when they started having the Andy Hardy movies and the kind of the character sort of fit with the times and the whole thing, there was a nice alchemy there.
Well, here we are in 2025, and
Oh,
basically,
great. I love that
it's,
picture.
it seems that every movie that the studio releases is designed for teenagers. It's
Yeah.
come full circle. Back in 1937, when Mickey Rooney reigned supreme over MGM, teenagers would be lucky to get a movie out of it. But today, they have been very honest. The studio executives are very honest. Their target audience is 12 to 24s, and obviously the teenagers are right there. They're the people who go to the movies the most, and they certainly embrace the Marvel universe, etc. But back in the late 30s, Louis B. Mayer, the great head of MGM Studios, the kind of fatherly figure, at least that's the way he liked to portray
Yeah.
himself, bought into doing some low budget movies with, is it Louis Stone playing? Uh,
Yeah, originally, yeah, Lewis Stone played Judge Hardy, although
right,
in the very first film it was Lionel Barrymore, but then
right,
he opted out of the role and Lewis Stone took it over. And
right. And then you get Mickey Rooney, which arguably, probably in film history, was the first real movie teenager.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, certainly, obviously, there have been movies about sort of young adolescence, but yeah, I think the Andy Hardy movies are the first ones where he's sort of really where he is in high school and he's kind of recognizably in that sort of high school culture and in a world that's very, although he's still living at home and his parents are, important parts of his world, he is kind of living in his own he is living in a kind of high school bubble, and that's I think the real difference between those and earlier movies that had sort of young protagonists. Also, I mean, what's interesting about the Andy Hardy movies too is they didn't really start as the Andy Hardy movies. They started as the Hardy family or the Judge Hardy movies. I mean, Judge Hardy was really the central character of the first couple films. But what happens is, I mean, between again the sort of alchemy of the time and also Mickey Rooney's talent and the way he fits the role, and I guess and certainly as I assume as the writer, I think they had basically one writer for the whole series. His name, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting, but I think the writer learned to write for him, and he sort of takes over the series. It becomes the Andy Hardy movies, and by the I think it's the fourth movie. I think it's Love Finds Andy Hardy. That's the first one where his name is in the title, as opposed to like Judge Hardy's Children is an earlier film, and then pretty much by that point, like then all the films have Andy's name in the title, and he's kind of, I mean, a more modern, more younger audiences, examples of this might be, he's kind of like the way Fonzie, if people remember Happy Days, kind of took over that series, or Urkel took over. I forget, was it Family Ties? I forget what series Urkel was in, but you get these breakout characters that start as kind of minor characters and then sort of take over the series and become the main events, and that's completely what happened with Andy Hardy.
What in researching Louis B. Mayer, what do you think the motivation for Louis was at that time to really push this kind of film series to the audience? This was not typical of MGM. I think you mentioned something about the fact that he did not like a lot of the darkness in film. He liked to bring out family values. Would that be accurate?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there's kind of like as is so often the case in Hollywood, there's sort of twin motives. I mean, one was profitability because these movies were pretty cheap to make. They didn't have elaborate sets. They could reuse the sets, whatever, and they were hugely popular. They were basically they're B movies that had that drew in sort of A profits. So that was part of it. But yeah, but he was also, I think, as far as I can tell, very sincere about the, kind of projecting these sort of all-American ideals. And he took, he apparently took a much sort of greater interest and was much more hands-on, as I understand it, with the Andy Hardy films than he was with most MGM films. Like he would typically wait to see kind of a rough cut of a film before he would weigh in. Whereas with the Andy Hardy movies, he would actually watch the daily rushes. I mean, he really cared about it. He policed. There were certain things where, maybe Andy Hardy was a little too, there might be a scene where he was a little too enthusiastic about the opposite sex, and Mayer would tell them to, like tone it down, reshoot it. There's a famous incident where, you know, Mayer had a whole thing about motherhood, and there was one scene where he felt like the scene was Andy is his girlfriend is kind of dumped him for like a handsome older guy, and he's depressed, and he comes home, and mom's made him a nice dinner, and he says, you know, I can't eat. I'm not hungry. And Meyer blew a gasket and said, "Oh my God, we can't have Andy Hardy insulting his mother. What all American boy would not want to eat his mother's cookie?" So they had to reshoot the scene. So I think Andy, I forget exactly how they reshot it, but they made him much more, less disdainful of his mother's, cooking. So
It's
yeah, that was the kind of thing that,
it's so funny that parents, teachers, administrators trying to hold the line on teenage hormones, probably one of the great struggles of humanity. And then, of course, you've got Mickey Rooney, who has been literally on stage since he was two, the son of vaudevillians. And I thought I found it very amusing the way you described Mickey's own little carnal interests. He apparently what one of the actresses on the lot actually referred to him as Andy Hardon.
yeah, I think that was Lana Turner, who he supposedly had an affair with. Yeah, I think my favorite quote in the book is, Ava Gardner, who was his first wife and was a starlet at MGM when they first met. Yeah, said that he went through the starlets at MGM like a hot knife through fudge. Yeah, Ava Gardner is just like a quote machine. I don't know your viewers, if they don't know that, I had a great time reading. There's a book that was published posthumously. I guess I forget the title, but Ava Gardner had been wanted to do a memoir, and she had a series of conversations with a British journalist, and it never amounted to anything, but he ended up publishing the kind of transcripts of their interviews, and they're completely entertaining. But yeah, so he was playing. I mean, that's one thing that's interesting to me about the Andy Hardy movies is how, so many of them are really about how kind of horny Andy Hardy is, and they're a little more, not that there's anything that would be, you know, sort of controversial or licentious, but they are pretty frank about, what a teenage boy is interested in. Which kind of surprised me. They were a little more virile, I guess, those movies than I maybe imagined them before I, started researching this.
Well, as a counterpart to the wholesomeness of the Hardys, you've got the Dead End Kids, which of course spawned so many different sequels and
Yeah.
variations, leading to the eventual Bowery Boy comedies. What can you talk about these kids?
Well, they're interesting. I mean, in some ways, they're kind of I mean, they're sort of like a perfect, kind of opposite of the Andy Hardy movies and of the whole, what we were talking about earlier about, kids sort of segregating into high school and sort of creating their own culture. Because these are really street kids. They're much more sort of the model of the, early 20th century or even 19th century kids, where I don't know, I've only seen a couple of their earliest movies. I don't think they're ever in school. They're just kind of running free. They're making money where they can. They're kind of, they're doing these small time cons and, ripping people off and swimming in the East River. I mean, that's kind of the more, they're kind of, I don't know quite how realistic. I mean, then yeah, as you say, then they get into all these kind of, comedies and much more silly stuff. But the early movies, they're at least, intended to have some, a certain kind of social realist aspect of what a certain kind of childhood was at the time. And I assume there's, I'm not not an expert on on that on teenage life, but I think they must be sort of fairly accurate that people watch them and believe them, and yeah, it's a much more sort of feral and much more sort of hanging out with adults. It's a totally different, it's kind of what why people were pushing kids to go into high school is kind of what you see in the Dead End Kid movies.
So the Depression ends, then we have the great calamity of World War II, which distracts the country for 5 years. And then going into the early 40s, I think the next person that I found, of course, as an iconic character, which moves ahead a few years, is, of course, James Dean
Yeah.
and the whole rebel without a cause story. Where does this figure in the history of teen movies?
Well, I mean, one thing that was interesting, like pretty soon, like starting in World War II, I mean, pretty soon after you have this kind of tipping point moment that the Andy Hardy movies celebrate, even during World War II, you start having a lot of fears, like you start having a lot of adult fears about juvenile delinquency and kids kind of running wild and kids being out of control and maybe getting, too into, violence and sex and drinking and whatever. I mean, that was partly because, World War II, a lot of, parents, a lot of fathers were away at the war, or parents, mothers and fathers were both, working in factories. So kids were unsupervised a lot, and that really created a lot of anxiety. And then, that carries over into the post-war, sorry, the phone is going off. Um, that kind of carries into the post-war period. And again, the more kids congregate, the more adults, start to mistrust them, or they're kind of anxious about them, and you start seeing. I mean, it's interesting because there was so many fears about juvenile delinquency in the 1950s. There were so many articles, and there were congressional hearings and stuff. But when you look at the crime statistics, I mean, obviously there were some kids who were delinquents, and there were certainly kids who committed horrible crimes, but there wasn't really a huge, statistically, there wasn't really a huge wave of delinquency going on. It was more about, I think in some ways it was more about, adults' fears about teenagers and who these kids were and who they were becoming.
Well,
And
especially if
also they
you
were, it was a more prosperous time, so kids were starting to have, more money. Kids could start having, as in Rebel Without a Cause, kids, could now afford to have their own cars and stuff that, with mobility became, even more independent. So, um, Rebel Without a Cause is fascinating because it's the writer director Nicholas Ray. Well, he didn't take sole screenplay credit, but it was really his. He really drove the movie and the creation of the movie, and it's him really making a concerted effort to kind of try to understand what's going on with kids in the early or mid 1950s, and this is what he comes up with. It's this tapping into this. It's also the beginning of kids really exhibiting a certain kind of angst about the world, a certain, uncertainty. I guess, it's partly, in some ways maybe that's a luxury because, you're not suddenly being, just thrown into the workplace at, 13 or whatever. You're starting to have a period where you can start to think about your future in a way. And obviously, there are things that are exciting and obviously good about that, but also, yeah, that leads to a certain amount of anxiety, I think. Kids are anxious about where they're going to fit into society. What does it mean? Do they want to ape the values of their adults? So anyways, you have all these kind of social, economic forces, in some ways even political forces. There's all kinds of sort of anxieties in the 1950s about, communism and what have you. I mean, it's funny because the stereotype is this is sort of, placid conformist decade, which I think parts of that are true, but also it was in some ways a very anxious decade. There was all kinds of, technological and economic changes going on. So that's all of that, is sort of reflected in the world of Rebel Without a Cause, combined with, Nick Ray's own, thoughts about teenagers and his own feelings about his own. He had a very sort of troubled, he was a troubled father with troubled kids himself, and it's probably he's trying to figure out himself. He's trying to figure out his kids. he's trying to situate this in society, and you end up with this, a kind of crazy masterpiece, I think.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about changes. I think certainly in terms of Hollywood and actors, this is a period the Marlon Brandos have come along. There's a different style of acting, a more
Well, yeah, that's one more change that's in the air. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
People, the young actors are more brooding. Certainly, I know that you mentioned it. Obviously, the success of East of Eden, his first film, was tremendous, and the timing was very good. I mean, this is a talk about an actor who was literally like a meteorite just flashing across the heavens, and then suddenly dies in a horrible traffic accident. Um, but James, tell us a little bit your perception of the impact James Dean had on teenagers at that time.
Well, I mean, just the people, I think I'm sorry, I don't have the book in front of me, but there's a quote from Martin Scorsese, who was a huge fan of I think he was 12 or something when the movie came out. And he said like the identification was total. I mean, I think, it's this. Again, I'm probably overusing the word alchemy, but it's the timing of the movie, the sort of psychological undercurrents of Nick Ray and the cast, and then yeah, this amazing performance by this amazing young actor just catalyzes the whole thing, and it just becomes this movie that has a huge impact on kids. It was a movie that kids went back to see again and again. And again, wasn't necessarily a movie made for teenagers. In some ways it's a movie kind of, I think in some ways it's made for adults to try to understand what's going on with teenagers. I mean, in some ways, the movie ends with Jim Backus playing James Dean's father, kind of, helping his son up and becoming a good father after having been a ineffectual father earlier in the movie. So in some ways, the climax of the movie is Jim Backus's moment, not James Dean's. But it's so powerful, and kids so identified with it that it just became bigger than the sum of its parts. Which is not to denigrate its parts because it has great parts, but it takes off. I mean, Bob Dylan, growing up in, I forget it, the northern reaches of Minnesota, he buys a red windbreaker like the one James Dean is wearing right behind you, and wears it constantly. Nicholas Ray had a great has a great anecdote that I quote in the book, where he's at MGM a few years later when Elvis Presley is making movies and Elvis comes into the commissary and sees Ray, and like, I think, gets down on his knee and starts reciting dialogue from the film. It was a huge impact on Elvis. Yeah, and obviously the fact that Dean died, like literally just a month before the film came out, that's yet another force multiplier. And I think it would have been a power. I mean, the movie doesn't rest on Dean's death. It's a powerful movie. It would have been a huge hit, I think, anyway. But the fact that he died, and it was in some sense, seen as a kind of, martyred figure, I think just added so much even more to the impact that I think it's hard almost, I think, for a modern audience to really understand how powerful, that film
Bruce,
was.
real quickly, just as an aside, your camera's bouncing up and down. Are
Oh,
you?
sorry. Yeah, I had it on my knee. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm getting
I
C.
kind of rented apartment with only with a couch. So I'll try to
No,
stop bouncing it so much.
I know
Apologies about
that's
that.
fine. That's fine. I loved your anecdote, by the way, about how much actors bring to a role where James has his big scene where he's railing and he starts smashing his hand against the desk or the wood table, and he eventually breaks a knuckle doing that.
Yeah.
He in a very short period of time, James Dean definitely impacted on movies. Now, going into the 1950s, I probably start going to my local movie house 57, 58, 59. And at that time, this was the big wave of exploitation science fiction movies. And
Right.
invariably, there would be teenagers making out in a lover's lane, and some creature was crawling out of something. And I'll put up my favorite of the period, which, of course, is The Blob with
Yeah.
an actor who is referred to as Stephen McQueen in the credits. And I mean, these were science fiction exploitation films. They weren't teen movies, but Hollywood loved to populate them with teens.
Well, and in some ways, yeah, they were a lot of them, teens were kind of the audiences. A lot of them, maybe I don't know, a lot of them, a lot of them were shown in drive-ins, which were really, basically, movie theaters for teenagers. Well, yeah, that's the thing. So even if they weren't directly, made as teen movies, yeah, you always had the teens making out in the lovers lane before the monster comes. And then you do have the ones like, that are, the horror exploitation movies like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein that, that literally are, made as kind of teen movies and teen. Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. I
Yeah.
mean, as the viewers and listeners know, I was the original Frady cat. I could not watch horror movies. I was a sheltered only child. So when my friends and I all went to the movies, I could stick with them during science fiction. But when they put on the horror movies, I sat in the lobby. It took me a few years to get my courage, but Michael Landon, actually on this poster, it's actually mentioned that he's from Bonanza. This was obviously a reissue, but
Yeah.
yeah, they
That's funny.
definitely.
The poster, they didn't quite get the likeness so great, but yeah,
He looks a little bit like Ricky Nelson in this picture for those who are watching
yeah.
on YouTube. But there are other
But
movies, Teenagers from Outer Space, Invasion of the Saucer Men, all of them involving teens and various levels of libido. Definitely a fun time for movies, and certainly teenagers were becoming certainly a much bigger part of the culture. I think you make a big point that, as you say, with income or allowance money or bar mitzvah money or whatever it was,
yeah,
they could buy their own things. And then we start coming to the late 50s. I enjoyed your conversation where you talk about the impact of Gidget with
yeah.
Sandra Dee, and I'm very familiar with this. One of my writing partners, or actually producing partners, he was developing a miniseries on the life of Sandra Dee and her relationship with Bobby Darin.
Oh, interesting.
But Sandra really comes on just perfectly as this little beach creature, almost like the mascot of a bunch of surfers. And I guess you could say that Gidget introduced surfing to the movies.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there must be some kind of I'm sure there's always an earlier example of something, like uh the podcaster Andrew Hickey, who has a music podcast, History of Rock and Roll, always says there's no first anything, and I'm sure that's true. But yeah, I think Gidget is pretty much the first, mainstream, big, successful surfing movie. Absolutely. And I think that was a movie that was probably for me, like researching this, that was one of the bigger surprises because I had never seen the original Gidget till I made this movie. I'd seen I remember watching the TV series with Sally Field in the 60s, but I my only knowledge of Gidget and Sandra Dee was really, from the song about, the song from Grease, Look at Me, I'm Sandra, like I just thought she was this kind of silly, shallow, horrible actor. But I think she's wonderful in that movie. And it's really, I mean, obviously it's dated and a lot of it's silly, but I think it's a very charming, winning movie. It was much more interesting and more complicated than I really thought. And it actually gets into, at some point in the movie, she decides she wants to lose her virginity, and it's kind of, you know, I think for its era, it was kind of, frank that maybe a girl might want to lose her virginity before marriage, for whatever reason. And
But
it's
but you
it's
but you couldn't say virginity on camera.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But what was going on, and it's yeah, and she's good. I think she's totally charming. She really, it's her movie. She really carries it. Um,
And with two very good actors having fun too, Cliff Robertson and James Darren. Just
Yeah, and they're both good too. And the whole sort of the whole beach gang, and yeah, and it's great, beautiful shots of Malibu or wherever Zuma. I forget where they shot it, but yeah,
I mean,
it's
when you find out that James Darren's character's name, his nickname is Moondog, I mean,
yeah,
it's pretty goofy, but it actually works. But this
yeah,
is 1959. Shortly, we get into you get into an extensive look at the movies of American International Pictures, obviously James Nicholson and Sam Arkoff, and
yeah,
then they decide to do something in their arena, having done a bunch of science fiction movies, they decide to make a little movie called Beach Party,
yeah,
and with Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon. And I was right there. I saw all the beach movies, and I lived in Southern California. I wasn't necessarily a beach person, but the idea of going to my movie theater on a Saturday morning and seeing a bunch of girls running around the beach in bikinis for a young man, very young at that time, I think I was 9, was easy viewing.
yeah. Yeah, no, they're fun. Yeah, they're fun movies. They have music, Stevie, little Stevie Wonder as he was billed then shows up, I think in the second one, Muscle Beach Party, or he's in one of them. Yeah, they have Dick Dale is it. Yeah, I mean they're fun, entertaining movies. I mean in some ways they're I think there's some ways you know, well, they're ahead of the time or behind the time, but they have that kind of energy of like a Marx Brothers movie where they'll kind of try anything. They'll break the fourth wall all the time. There'll be a bunch of dumb gags, and then maybe there'll be a pretty good gag. They remind me, a little bit of, kind of Saturday Night, more recently kind of Saturday Night Live movies where they just, part of their charm is that they very aggressively don't take themselves too seriously. I don't want to make too great a case for these movies, but I totally get why, like you as a, I don't know, 16-year-old or however old you were, like was totally into them
Oh,
and
I was
enjoying them.
younger, but I
Yeah.
think
Well,
that
probably, yeah, then even more so.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, remember, I was the one sitting in the lobby when the horror movies were running. So when the
Yeah.
Beach Party movies came out, I was totally front and center and just enjoying all the tan bodies on the beach.
Yeah, it's cute boys, cute girls. There's something
And
for
then, of
everybody.
course, having
Yeah.
been a Mickey Mouse Club watcher, that was a
Yeah.
major impact for me in TV. Probably one of the first TV shows I embraced. I knew about Annette Funicello, and she was just adorable. I mean, Annette Funicello was the poster girl for just unadulterated cuteness. And I love the
Yeah.
fact that you talked about the fact that since she was under contract, or at least had some kind of legal relationship with Walt Disney. Walt Disney actually called up Sam Arkoff and asked him or asked Annette not to show her belly button.
Yeah, they said yeah, it was because she could be it was okay for her to be in a two-piece, but they didn't want her navel showing, which I guess, was actually kind of was sort of a thing in movies. It was interesting. I looked it up. It wasn't actually officially in the production code. I forget the exact wording of the production code, but the production code was widely interpreted and understood to sort of ban navels, and it wasn't really till like around this time when you start seeing a lot of like the other girls showing their navels.
Well,
And
you
actually,
you you point
if
out
you if
that,
you do watch the first Beach Party movie, like sort of you do see her belly button a couple
well,
times, but then you still like famously, like what I Dream of Jeannie, Barbara Eden couldn't show her belly button on
and
TV, and
yet
that's like
over
what, three or
and
four
yet
later years later.
and yet over at United Artists, Ursula Andress comes out of the water and Doctor No, showing that belly button. You know,
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's a good example. That's probably like the first big mainstream belly button right
belly
there.
button. I mean, at a time when the world is about to enter the Vietnam War, there's a lot of serious problems going around the world. I find it fascinating that these censors would focus on the belly button. I mean, my
Yeah.
goodness. Of course, this is the time when married couples, could not sleep in the same bed.
Yeah.
But all of this was changing, and I think that not long after this, we start to see people testing the codes, and I think one of the big impact movies about 10 years later, Midnight Cowboy, gets released under an
Yeah.
X rating, etc. But The movie I would like to talk about next as a kind of a trend-setting movie, of course, um, was, I'm going to pull it up right now, 1973,
Oh,
American
American Graffiti.
Graffiti.
Yeah.
And this was such a revolutionary film, just pure entertainment value, so much fun to see many of these future stars. I mean, we knew Ron Howard from Opie and the Andy Griffith Show, but a lot of these actors and actresses, we didn't know who they were.
Yeah. Well, this is my sweet spot too, because I think I was 14 when this came out. So this was kind of the big teen movie of my era because they hadn't really there was kind of a period in the kind of late 60s, early 70s where the teen movie, they're much more interested in yeah, kind of, bikers and war heroes and the dropouts and the teens are kind of ignored for a while except for maybe, Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, which
And
maybe could be a
you
teen
mentioned
movie.
2 years before Graffiti's release, you mentioned Summer of
Oh,
42.
Summer of 42. Yeah, of course, that's a great one. And
Right.
also, yeah, and the Last Picture Show, which in some ways I don't really talk about too much in the book because even though teenagers are very forefront in that, in some ways, to me, it's more a portrait of a whole town. Um,
Well,
but
Summer,
yeah,
yes,
graffiti for me, that was probably the first. Yeah, that was my real big. I remember seeing it, several times and getting the soundtrack. I mean, also it was a great introduction to all that sort of, that all that kind of old 50s rock and roll, which I didn't really, and a lot of, people my age hadn't really been exposed to before. So that was great. But also I think it's interesting because that's really the first teen movie that's made by somebody who had actually been like a teenager in the kind of modern post-war sense. George Lucas, who was class of 1962, as are the Ron Howard and Richard Dreyfuss characters in the movie. So he's a filmmaker who's really making a teen movie from the inside, who really kind of understands the rituals. I mean, it's such a great. I mean, in some ways, he had studied anthropology a little bit in college, and in that sense, the movie is so good because it captures those early 60s rituals of cruising. And did you cruise? Did you have cruising in your high school in Southern California?
well, I was going to bring up that point. The movie kind of exposed me to the concept of getting in your car. I think I had my first car in '69, 4 years earlier. I got a brand new Mustang Fastback for $3,200. We saved
Oh,
quarters to
sweet.
2 years. So I had a car, and the concept of cruising, I didn't go out to Van Nuys Boulevard in the valley, but my friends and I would get in our car and we'd drive down Sunset. But the idea of just cruising and meeting people that way was a fun idea. I think I got into the last bit of it because I think it kind of disappeared shortly thereafter. But I often use another James Bond reference from Goldfinger. It seems Goldfinger had such an impact on me that James Bond is in Switzerland. He's chasing this woman, turns out to be Tilly Masterson in her Mustang, and he looks at his speedometer and suddenly slows down and he says to himself, "Discipline 007, discipline." That was probably me in many cases where I
Yeah,
was probably driving a little too fast. But car culture is such a part of American graffiti, and it's certainly a lot of fun. The Hollywood had traded in surfboards in the sand for the concrete of the roadway.
yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting movie too because it's funny because it's a nostalgic movie. Obviously, George Lucas is looking back 10 years to his own high school days, but in some ways, it's a movie about nostalgia because the kids in the movie are sort of nostalgic for their own high school experience, which I think is to me is a very sort of primal teenage emotion. I remember feeling that way myself, kind of at the end of senior year, like having all this kind of misty-eyed feeling like, oh, these were the best years of our lives, whatever. I didn't really think that, but I did have a lot of, kind of sentimental emotion about it. I mean, that's basically the stuff of, what yearbooks are made of. So, it's funny because Lucas is both sort of taking advantage of that and then commenting on it at the same time, I think.
bolstered by one of the great soundtracks of all
Yeah.
time. I mean,
Which is an oldies soundtrack. I mean, that's it's the most of the music is, the movie is set in the last night of summer in 1962. But yeah, most of the movies are to the characters. They're listening to golden oldies. It's like golden oldies weekend. I think actually, like, I think that's one of the first things you hear in the movie is there's like you hear like static of somebody turning a radio dial, and then you hear something like, Golden Weekend or something, and then Rock Around the Clock is the first song in the film, which of course was famously, introduced to the world, or most of the world, in Blackboard Jungle back in, at the same time, the same year that Rebel with a Cause came out, and
sure.
was kind of, for many, at least white teenagers, was their first introduction to, rock and roll, and a huge thing. So again, yeah, it's like, that's that double thing I'm talking about, where it's, these are, it's nostalgic for the kids in the movie as well as for the audience in 1973 or 2025 watching the movie. It's kind of an interesting, hall of mirrors there.
Recently we saw I'm sure you saw it as well, the latest Quentin Tarantino, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
Oh, I love that movie. Yeah.
which also had a really full-throated soundtrack of all the period songs from '69. And I felt a lot of that same just depth on the soundtrack.
Well, I
So,
love how he kind of resurrected Paul Revere and the Raiders in
oh
that
yeah,
movie. There's
no,
a great scene
exactly.
where,
And the other thing about graffiti, just great actors, just having a lot of fun with the characters early in their careers. Richard Dreyfuss, obviously Ronnie Howard, just really fun people, and young Harrison Ford, and of course the the very mysterious Suzanne Summers
yeah.
in her T-Bird. It's funny. I worked on a short film at Showtime directed by Richard Dreyfuss, and I was so enamored with American Graffiti. I had to ask him something, and then I was referring to Suzanne Summers in that white and that pink Corvette, and it wasn't a pink Corvette; it was a white T-Bird. So he
Yeah.
looked at me kind of askance. Sometimes the details get drowned out. Um, now we come to, we get into the '70s, and then we move into the '80s, and a gentleman named John Hughes comes on the scene, first with 16 Candles. And John Hughes, as I mentioned to you in one of our pre-talks, I actually ended up working with him as the unit publicist on Pretty in Pink,
Mhm.
which was released a couple years after. But tell us a little what you feel is the impact of a John Hughes on teenage movies.
Well, I think he's really, he's such a fascinating character. Like, I remember loving those movies. I was in my 20s when those movies came out, but I guess part of the reason I wrote this book is I've sort of been a fan of teen movies my whole life, and I've sort of kept going to it. So I've seen those movies in the 20s, and I really loved them. And to me, a lot of them haven't aged that well, for different reasons. But I think he just had a gift for speaking to teenagers. I mean, he really, I mean, even more like, I was talking about, American Graffiti and George Lucas having been a teenager, and kind of making a film from the inside, which he is doing, but he's still there's kind of an anthropological distance in that movie, whereas John Hughes really gets into I think the real emotions of these characters. I mean, he's really making movies for teenagers. Even American Graffiti, as great as it is, and as great as I've loved it as a teenager, in some ways, it's still it's a movie really made for people in their 20s or 30s looking back on that time. Whereas these are movies that they're just really communing with teenagers in a way I don't think anybody had really quite done before. Even, Rebel Without a Cause might be the closest example of a movie that just really understood this sort of complex and sort of heightened emotionality of teenagers. I mean, there's sort of an operatic quality to Rebel Without a Cause that I think sort of captures a teenage emotionality. And I think there's sort of you know, kind of not quite as intense, but there is a slightly operatic or sort of inflated quality to the Hughes movies that I think captures that. I mean, and Molly Ringwald was such a great actress for him. I mean, she could really capture that, you know, I mean, there's scenes in 16 Candles where she's upset because her, parents have forgotten her birthday, and it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of silly because, I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but when she like kind of rolls her eyes, or when she kind of slumps, when she's embarrassed because she thinks she's, humiliated herself in front of the guy she has a crush on, you really feel it, and you're really meant to feel it. You're meant to feel it the way she experiences it. You're not, the movie isn't condescending to her like the way Gidget kind of condescends to Gidget, and oh, she's so cute or whatever. I mean, this is like, this, this is movie is 100% there with Molly Ringwald's character, and that was Hughes's gift, that he could see that and feel that and communicate that, and draw that from his actors, or cast his movies in a way. Anthony Michael Hall, I think, is really underrated. He's so good in both 16 Candles. I mean, he makes it like a ridiculous character, and in some ways, and he's in a lot of sort of scenes that I think have, now feel offensive, but he's still funny. He's good, and he's great in Breakfast Club. You really feel the pain of his character. Again, that could be sort of a, stereotypical nerd character, but he brings real emotion to it.
Well,
Some combination of the writing, directing, and the performers. Those
well,
movies just dig into these kids in a way that nobody had really done before, I don't think.
Well, The Breakfast Club certainly has to be one of the most serious examinations, and so respectfully done by Hughes. Howie Deutsch directed Pretty in Pink, and certainly being around Hughes on the set, he was very serious about everything. He brought a serious respect and understanding for teenagers, and then Breakfast Club comes along, and it was a very sophisticated film in many ways in terms of just getting into the teen heads. It was just like teenagers had come of age as characters, and they really jump out at you. And I think this was one of his biggest hits.
Yeah, it was, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's it's really, a tribute to him and his producers that they trusted him to make a movie. It's just, basically most of the movie is just five kids sitting in a room talking to each other. I mean, it's really like it's really a kitchen sink Broadway play, but set in a library. But it's just, yeah, it's kids, it's kids talking. I mean, in some ways, it's like, if you just looked at it structurally, it's like, it's like an indie movie. It's, long speeches, kind of static, whatever. It's in some ways, yeah, for a kind of a mainstream movie, and certainly for a mainstream teen movie, it's really pretty radical, I think.
How would you compare the Hughes films to Amy Heckerling's Fast Times at Ridgemont High?
Well, again, I think, I mean, to me, to me, yeah, Fast Times at for me, American Graffiti, Fast Times, Ridgemont High, Clueless, and Mean Girls were probably that's the Mount Rushmore of teen movies for me. And I think Fast Times has aged for me better than the Hughes movies, and I think it tells a lot of truths about teenage life. But again, I think it does have that slightly, I think it shares with American Graffiti a slightly sort of anthropological edge to it. He's not, the movie isn't asking you to totally identify with those characters the way The Breakfast Club or 16 Candles or Pretty in Pink is asking the audience to identify with the characters in those films. There's a certain kind of a distancing that's going on. So I think, um, to me, Fast Times is a quote unquote better film, but is it a more powerful film? I don't necessarily think so. That's another one worth talking about, though. Again, starting with American Graffiti, and then with Fast Times, and also with The Outsiders, you start having these movies where with these amazing casts of mostly at the time unknowns who go on to have these incredible careers. I mean, yeah, just right behind you, you have like Sean Penn and Jennifer Jason Leigh and Judge Reinhold. I mean, who are all, I think, I can't remember. I think it's Jennifer Jason Leigh's first film. It's maybe Sean Penn's second. Judge Reinhold, I'm not sure, but yeah, these are three. I mean, especially Penn and Jennifer Jason Leigh are, two
Well,
of the greatest actors of their generation.
we should say that the popularity of teen movies has reached all over Hollywood, and not only to white audiences. You get a movie like Boys in the Hood from John Singleton, which was also a trend-setting movie, I think perhaps for the mainstream, bringing young black youth to the forefront for the first time with a very young actor named Cuba Gooding Jr.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's it. Yeah, yet again, and there's, and then also Ice Cube in his first movie. So, yeah, this is again yet another film with a and yeah, and Angela Bassett plays his mom, and it's another film with like an amazing, amazing cast, and then mostly unknowns. And yeah, Lawrence Fishburne was, was more known, but again, that's one of his signature parts in that film. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting movie because I mean Singleton, who was I don't have it exactly in front of me. I think he's 21 or 22 when he made it. He had literally just graduated from USC Film School and he'd written the script as a student, and you know, uh, Columbia, bought it, and after some initial trepidation, agreed to let him direct it. And so he's making a movie about his own high school experiences, the way George Lucas was, but he's doing it, just 4 years after he'd been in high school. So there's a real immediacy to that film, and I think for white audiences, they were seeing a world that they didn't know, and for black audiences, they were seeing a world that they did know, but they hadn't seen in film before. Like and I quote a number of filmmakers, including Barry Jenkins, who went on to do Midnight, who saw the film when he was a kid, and he was like, I can't believe. I forget exactly what the quote, but it's something, I can't believe they're allowed to make movies about us like this. It was a hugely influential movie for a whole generation of filmmakers. And it's another movie that I think really it really holds up. I mean, it's just, he was the I think Singleton was well, I think the youngest director ever nominated for for a Best Director Oscar. He'd actually beat out Orson Welles, I think, by a few months in terms of age, but it really, I don't want to overdo it, but it certainly has that feeling of Citizen Kane in the sense of just a young filmmaker of huge talent and just kind of hitting on all cylinders, and
Well,
just you just can't believe that a novice can has such control over the medium. I mean, there are scenes in Boys in the Hood that I just think are were powerful then and remain powerful. It's a film that really I think has aged very well and retains its power.
I think the idea of teen protagonists reaches one of its ultimate qualities with the Hunger Games movies.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, yeah, I mean that's so yeah, I mean in some ways when I've been talking to people about the book, some people say, it's almost like, oh, Hunger Games, does that really count as a teen movie? But I think it does because one, it's it's it is a teen protagonist, and it's a movie about teenagers. It's set in we're not in Andy Hardy world anymore. We're not in South Central, but I think I think those movies do serve as a kind of a a metaphor for the kind of the kind of competition, and at least sometimes the maybe the emotional brutality of high school, and certainly like as many teenagers do, they sort of feel like they're kind of you sometimes feel like you're living in this between your parents and your teachers or whatever, you sort of feel like you're living in a in a totalitarian dystopia. So in some ways I think it was a kind of a
no,
really
so
brilliant stroke to kind of take those emotions and actually sort of play it out in a in a much more literal way. I mean, it's to me those movies are funny because I think in some ways I think they're sort of ridiculous and overstated, but they are really power. They're really powerful. They're really entertaining. They get under your skin. I mean, I enjoyed all those movies, very much. And, obviously I know that, they speak to those and of course, the Suzanne Collins, original novels that they're based on, speak hugely to young people and as well as old people like me.
well, certainly with the emergence of blockbuster genre pictures like Star Wars, where the protagonists are teens, targeting audiences of teenagers, having teenage protagonists makes sense. And I know you mentioned the Twilight movies. There's so many aspects of teen culture now are in mainstream movies, and as I mentioned at the top of the show, it seems that every movie that the studios churns out seems to be for that target audience. We get an Oppenheimer once in a while now, whereas in 1940, 95% of the movies were targeted that way. Well,
Yeah, well, I think even yeah, I mean, again, yeah, going back to Andy Hardy movies were family pictures. They weren't, they didn't have primarily teenage audiences. It's you start, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's around the when AIP, like in the late 50s and 1960s, they start targeting teenagers. But again, those movies, and they made money, they were profitable, but those weren't like the most biggest blockbusters of their time, they were nice, profitable B pictures. It's really, yeah, like around the time of kind of late 70s with Jaws and start where you start having those blockbusters, but then they also start realizing that, well, part of the reason these are blockbusters is because teenagers are going to see them again and again. Including myself, I was 18 when Star Wars came out, and I saw it, I think, 3 or 4 times that summer. I was like, the classic perfect example of that. So then, yeah, then starting in the 80s, you start having, like, hey, let's make movies about teenagers. And um, I mean, it's funny. I think you earlier you mentioned Marvel movies too. At one point, I was considering I was going to do, a chapter about Marvel movies as kind of teen movies because again, they're sort of in some ways their concerns, I mean, which is true of comic books in general. They're kind of stories of kind of teen angst and teen powerlessness and teen fantasies about power, sort of, writ large and again, sort of put on this kind of, pop operatic scale of superheroes. But I think they're really dealing with kind of quintessential sort of adolescent dilemma. So I had a whole thing I was gonna do about that, and I think I reduced it to like a one-liner in passing or something. But I think those, yeah, I mean, I think you could certainly make the argument that those are teen, something like Thunderbolts is a teen, is a kind of a teen movie, in, shaggy dog clothing or something.
well, the title of the book is Hollywood High, a totally epic way opinionated history of teen movies. Our guest today has been Bruce Handy. Bruce, thank you so much for sharing your research and your fascination with this period, and just a really terrifically written book.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really my pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
You've been watching and listening to Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. Please just keep tuning in. We love hearing from our fans. As you know, we have another podcast called Tales from Hollywoodland, which you can Google. But on behalf of everybody here, thank you for listening and watching today.